This is a History of Western Thought, number 20 on Middle Platonism. Now, this brings us to the last of our pre-Christian philosophies before we get into the rise of Christianity and Christian philosophy. That's not to say that we won't be doing anything that's not Christian philosophy, as we will still have to look at Neoplatonism and a number of other movements as well. But Middle Platonism brings us to the second major period of Platonism. Platonism is generally divided into three distinct categories. We have first the original Platonism with Plato, and then we have Neoplatonism with Plotinus and other similar figures. But then we have this middle period that has been given the name Middle Platonism. And the Middle Platonists probably are not as influential as Plato himself, certainly, or as the Neoplatonists, but they are an important part of the history of philosophy. Now, Middle Platonism is a rough term. It doesn't identify one particular figure, but we're talking about Platonism roughly from the years 90 BC until about 200 AD, when we see the transition into Neoplatonism. Well, Middle Platonism arose in response to skepticism, which was dominant at this time in the New Academy. And the New Academy was a school in Athens, the kind of reiteration of what was Plato's own academy in Athens. And so this was a response to skepticism within the 2nd century BC. The Middle Platonists wrestled with the connection between Plato himself and older Platonic philosophy and later philosophical schools. Those included Stoicism, Aristotelianism, and skepticism. And so Middle Platonism ends up being a kind of eclecticism. It is indebted to Plato in terms of certain ideas, but the Middle Platonists are largely eclectically grabbing from a number of different philosophical schools and bringing them together. Now, who are some of the major figures that are associated with Neoplatonism? I have 6 of them listed here, and we'll look in depth at 3 of them. The first is Antiochus of Ascalon. His years are 130 BC to 68 BC. Next, we have the very well-known Plutarch, known more as a historian than anything else. The years are 46 AD to 119 AD. Then we have Alcinous, who is in the 2nd century AD. We don't have his exact dates. He wrote an influential book for Middle Platonism that's meant to be a handbook on Platonism called the Handbook of Platonism. Then we have Albinus, 2nd century AD. Again, we don't have his exact dates. He has a text called Introduction to Plato's Dialogues. Then we have Theon of Smyrna, and he is in the 1st to 2nd century AD. Again, we don't have the exact dates. He has a text called Mathematics Useful for the Understanding of Plato, which is a discussion of Plato and his relationship to Neo-Pythagoreanism. Then we have Numenius of Apamea, 2nd century AD, who combined Neo-Pythagoreanism and Platonism as well. And he becomes this kind of transitional figure between Middle Platonism and what we know as Neoplatonism. Antiochus is the first one that we're going to speak about. Now, Antiochus was aware of the newer philosophical movements, primarily Stoicism as well as the Peripatetics, who were largely indebted to the philosophy of Aristotle. And he sought to engage how it is that Plato's philosophy interacted with those particular philosophies. And Antiochus came to the conclusion that both the Stoics and the Peripatetics were significantly, largely in agreement with Platonism. And he argued that these skeptics of the New Academy that had kind of taken over the academy had really lost their way and needed to go back to all 3 of these philosophical schools, which, again, he believed were in some kind of fundamental agreement. Antiochus, as well as many of the Middle Platonists, started to move the questions of philosophy away from the metaphysical ones that we've been talking about largely in this series. And that was largely Plato's focus, but not exclusively Plato's focus. And instead, they chose to focus on the practical things of Platonic philosophy. So there was a significant focus on ethics in Antiochus's writings. And it's within that field of ethics that Antiochus found a lot of agreement. He noted that there is a virtue ethic that exists and is taught from the Stoics to the Peripatetics to the Platonists. And as most virtue ethicists are, these schools of thought and these figures that represent these schools of thought are also eudaimonists, which means that they prize the happy life as the goal of ethics. Happy not meaning internal pleasure, but the well-ordered life. They all agree that there is a natural law. And Antiochus grabs onto this idea of natural law as really central to his own philosophical project. And he argues that really it is the highest ethic to live in accordance with nature. The more we live in accord with nature and how it is that we are to function in nature with the rhythms of nature, that we are then living the happy life, the good life. Now, Antiochus and some of the other Middle Platonists as well differ from Plato in that they emphasize the bodily nature of virtue and the bodily nature of ethics, the bodily nature of human life. Plato, at times, because of his focus on the realm of ideas or the forms, could often kind of neglect the goods of the body. This is apparent, for example, in the way that Plato speaks about art. And so Antiochus grabs onto this idea that there are plenty of physical goods. There are goods of the body that we need to see as goods in their proper order, but goods nonetheless. And so he believes that there are certain physical goods that we are called to strive for, not just the intellectual goods. And he mentions, for example, health or the beauty of the body, care for the body. However, with understanding that there are these external or bodily goods that we can and should strive for, Antiochus recognizes that these are not the highest goods. So even if we're talking about things that perhaps are not specifically physical, but things that are maybe more social goods, like honor in society, like a good reputation, those kinds of things are goods, but they are not the highest goods. And so, like Plato, he is going to make the argument that the highest goods, the most important goods, are those that are mental. He speaks about virtues, and he primarily speaks in terms of 4 specific virtues. The first of those is prudence, the second is courage, the third is justice, and the fourth is sophrosine, which is not a term that we use today, but it's a general and broad term that's used both in Greece and in Rome to refer to a kind of excellence or perfection in both mind and character. It's kind of a catch-all term. And these alone, for Antiochus, are necessary to attain happiness. And so even though things like wealth or honor, the various material and physical goods are certainly aids in our achievement of happiness, they are not absolutely necessary for a good life. However, the virtues are necessary to attain the good life. Antiochus speaks about virtue as a kind of process and speaks about the attainment of virtue as a progress. And so he says that we move away from this initial desire that we have that is simply for self-preservation, the preservation of our bodies largely, to this development then of the inner character that lives in accord with nature or natural law. And what we attain as we grow in virtue is this kind of balance between the inner self and the outer self being the body with normal bodily desires and wants, and this inner self or this higher self that desires and delights in these mental or intellectual goods. And so Antiochus focuses on all of these ethical questions to the point that he really neglects the metaphysical questions that were so central to Platonic philosophy as well as the philosophers prior to Plato that we discussed. Physics and metaphysics, and often those two are identical within ancient Greek thought, are abstract for Antiochus, and therefore differences on those particular points are not essential. Here, Antiochus departs significantly from Plato in that he doesn't really have any clear idea of the forms or the mental ideas. Reality for Antiochus is largely physical. He does adopt also a concept of a kind of prime matter, as Aristotle does. There is this kind of just matter or stuff in its natural state that has to take on a kind of form. However, he doesn't move from that to hylomorphism, which is Aristotle's perspective on the relationship between form and matter. He believes that matter is infinitely divisible, and so he rejects the idea of the atomists that if you were to break things down to their smallest parts, you could come to some tiny indivisible particle that makes up all things. Instead, he argued that that's not possible. You can, in fact, ad infinitum just continue to go smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And the next major figure that we're going to just briefly discuss is Plutarch. Now, Plutarch is influential primarily as a historian. Plutarch wrote a very famous work, Parallel Lives, where he discusses the relationship between Julius Caesar in Rome and Alexander the Great, paralleling the lives of these two great leaders. And so we know him primarily as a historian, but it is worth noting that he does delve into philosophical ideas in his writings. And he was also clearly well educated within the Middle Platonic school of thought. And so how is it that Plutarch saw himself philosophically? Well, he referred to himself as a Platonist. He certainly saw himself as being in continuity with the great classical Greek philosopher. But Plutarch, like many of the other Middle Platonists, is not exclusively relying on the ideas or writings of Plato. So he does not only just cite Plato's dialogues. Instead, he is reading widely within other philosophical schools in Rome. He draws some from the Peripatetics. Again, the Peripatetics are a school of thought that is largely influenced by Aristotle. Plutarch criticized Stoicism significantly throughout his writings. Stoicism had a very large presence within ancient Rome. However, even though Plutarch criticized the Stoics on certain significant points, he actually used Stoic philosophy as well. And as we discussed, Epicureanism, Plutarch adamantly rejected Epicureanism. And this is something that you'll note among the Middle Platonists in general, is that they are willing to draw from the Peripatetics, they are willing to draw from the Stoics, and the Pythagoreans and the Neo-Pythagoreans. However, the Middle Platonists generally do reject the writings of and ideas of the Epicureans. The Epicureans are really kind of an anomaly within philosophical schools. They tend to be those who are more rejected by other philosophers than other schools. So they're the one that seemingly has the least kind of respect from various other philosophical schools. And that really is because of their hedonism that we talked about, though as we discussed, we do have to be careful in just referring to them as hedonists, as there is more to their system than simply the love of pleasure. So Plutarch's metaphysics. Here, we see that Plutarch did believe in an immaterial God. Plutarch rejected, therefore, the idea of both the Stoics and the Epicureans that God himself, or the gods as they saw it, had to be material. Instead, he believed, like Plato and like Aristotle, that there was a foundation of being that he's calling God that is immaterial. And in this way, Plutarch, his ideas are more similar to Jewish thought as well as the then arising Christian thought of his time. However, along with this conviction of an immaterial God, Plutarch is a bit of a dualist. He believed that there is this kind of opposing principle to God who is good, and this is a world soul. And this is really an evil world soul, which is tied to matter. And this is an idea that you see arising at this time that's going to have significance throughout the medieval period. And a number of the identified Christian heresies in the Middle Ages have this kind of dualistic theology that you see within Plutarch. And generally, when you see these dualistic ideas, there is a good God that is immaterial and this kind of evil force that opposes God that is tied to the material world. And this then generally leads to a conception that matter or the physical world is somehow in itself evil, and that it is the goal of the philosopher or the follower of whatever particular religious ideology this may be that takes on this idea to essentially escape the world of the physical. Plutarch, along with this, believed strongly in human free will, and this was in response to the Stoics. This is one of the main areas where he criticizes the Stoics, and he says that we do have this free will to choose between good and evil. We can make different choices. He believes that human beings have an eternal soul, and this eternal soul is not material. This has to do with Plutarch's, again, conception that that which is not material is the highest good. similar to how Plato views the forms. And so we see within Plutarch something that is far more Platonic metaphysically than we looked at previously in some of the other Middle Platonists before him. In his religious convictions, Plutarch, of course, was clear, as I said, about the immateriality of God, the existence of God, as well as the existence of some kind of evil principle or force that was tied to matter. And Plutarch, along with that, believed that human religions, and he's looking at the religions of Rome at this time, were kind of myths that also contained truth within them. And so Plutarch believed that there were these underlying kind of eternal truths and realities that were couched under this mythological language. Somewhat similar to what we see within the 20th century when we see this demythologization project with someone like Rudolf Bultmann, where it is argued that the stories of Scripture or the narratives of Christianity that you find in the Apostles' Creed are really just myths that have this eternal truth underneath them. And that's similar to what Plutarch is saying here about the Roman myths. And so he believes certainly in the existence of God. He is not a secular, atheistic, materialist thinker by any means, but he does reject the literal sense of the mythologies of this time. Well, that gives you a broad overview of Middle Platonism. As I said, there are many figures that we could talk about, and we only chose to just look at two of these here in this video. Next time, we are going to be looking at the New Testament and the way that the New Testament engages with the ideas of the Greek philosophers. Make sure you subscribe here on this channel, and you can subscribe to my podcast as well. It's called the Just and Sinner Podcast. You can find it on whatever podcast app you have. We'll see you in the next one. God bless.